and I would like to welcome you to the second annual Seattle March for Innocence. This event is sponsored by SOAAR Global, Support for Organized Abuse and Addiction Recovery Global, Seattle branch, the Seattle Truth Network, and the Milliontown March. We've got some folks out here tonight to take a stand for innocence, for children, for all of us, and for all of humanity. Our mission is to organize about the reality of extreme abuse that is happening to children. Today is Justice for Satanic Ritual Abuse, a heavy theme for a heavy topic, and we are out here to talk about what really has happened related to this topic. And we're going to hear from Sir of Satanic Ritual Abuse, Alandra Markman. We are also going to hear the summarized story of Neil McClanahan, a criminal justice professional. But before we go into our agenda tonight, I'd like to introduce Victoria Palmer, who is a representative of the Seattle Truth Network and a real inspiration for me for taking the message out to the streets and exercising our right to public assembly and free speech and making demands about what we as citizens want to see in our world. So without further ado, here is Victoria Palmer.
Well, hello. Thank you, Anastasia, and thank you for having me here tonight. I had the fortune of meeting Anastasia Sprout through my freedom activities. Just things brought us together as we were standing up to those mandates that were trying to force us to wear masks. And so we were brought together. And so I invited her into the Seattle Truth Network, where we stand together as volunteers to speak truth and to stand for freedom. And so it has been my pleasure to become a good friend of Anastasia. And just to say a few words about her, she is a really good example of someone who is turning her experience from the past into something positive. She's bringing it out and sharing with others who have had similar pasts and doing what she can to improve it for others, to improve it for the kids who are facing this right now, and to prevent it from happening to other kids. And so the message is that by standing our ground and by getting our message out, we can affect change by spreading it through people to do the right thing. And so Anastasia is a delightful person. She's got a big heart, and she's so compassionate for others. Anastasia is a practicing psychotherapist and author, and she does everything she can just to help and get the message out. And she's supported my activities with Seattle Truth Network and the March for Freedom. And so on that note, I'm here for her tonight, and so I'm just going to turn it back over to her and let her get the program started.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you. So we are here at the Gates Foundation in Seattle, Washington, and we're here for a reason. We're here because we're in the shadow of the Seattle Center, which is, many say, part of the heartbeat of Seattle. But there's a friend of mine who is an investigative journalist named Nick Bryant. Nick wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal. I highly recommend it. And he was talking about a case back in the day that a lot of people have never heard about. But there's a case that's related to the Franklin Scandal that there's a lot of parallels, which is the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. And Nick Bryant published the flight logs of the Jeffrey Epstein dubbed plane Lolita Express, and multiple times Bill Gates was listed as being on the flight log of having taken flights to Epstein Island, where of course there was a great investigation that revealed underage child exploitation. So we are here to protest that there is the appearance of city and global leaders who actually have evidence that they are participating in child sex trafficking, and we are not okay with that. So we want to take a moment to, just for me, I always want to start just taking a moment of silence for the children that are still trapped. That may be trapped underground here in Seattle in various places. I believe they are. That may be trapped underground in jails, dungeons, cages around the world. We've got a windy night tonight, but that doesn't deter us. So we're just going to take a moment of silence for children and adults. And you know, I am a survivor of organized extreme abuse. And in my abuse, there was a term that my captors used called the throwaway kids. And I've heard other survivors have similar terms for children that are called or pulled by the cult and they're destined for murder. And I'm here to say tonight that there are no throwaway children. And this sign, no more SRA or TBMC, Save Our Kids. SRA stands for Satanic Ritual Abuse, and Trauma-Based Mind Control is TBMC. So we know that these things exist and children are still suffering right now. So I'm just going to take a few moments of silence to honor and hold these children and say, we may not be able to free you right now, but we are with you in our hearts, and we are coming for you as quickly as we can. Thank you. So our first official speaker, Neil McClanahan, was unable to join us. We found out today that he is taken ill and he was not able to make the trek up from Olympia, Washington to be here. So I'm sad about that, but I am going to give a presentation based on his detailed notes that he has shared. So you'll still get to hear the story of Neil McClanahan's experience with the Paul Ingram case. However, I do want to acknowledge last year's speakers. So this is the second annual March for Innocence. And last year, our first annual, we had 2 speakers. And the first one was Lynn Crook. And Lynn put out a book that's still available now. It's called False Memories, The Deception That Silenced Millions. And here's a picture of her book cover. I actually gave her book to someone else, so I don't have it with me because it's in circulation. Lynn is a survivor of child sexual abuse who took to the courts seeking justice. And she had a very successful process with the legal system. She sued and was successful in receiving damages from her abuser. So I asked Lynn if she could come today, but she was unable to be here with us. But she said, here's a summary of my book, How Child Molesters and Their PhDs Conned Us into Believing Our Abuse Memories Are False. So she really took on the quote-unquote false memory syndrome foundation, if I'm getting those letters right, which is now defunct. And I really believe it has to do with her book coming out. When we tell the truth, the world changes. Our second speaker last year was Mary Knight, and Mary talked a bit last year about her own story. You can hear it on last year's video. Her book, My Life Now, Essays by a Child Sex Trafficking Survivor. And this is her book cover. I don't know if you can see it there. It's a little on the small side. Get a little closer there. See that? So Mary also wished us well tonight, with us in spirit, as a lot of our friends and family are here from a distance. So I'm going to go into this incredible story that happened to take place in Washington State. So Neil McClanahan was a Thurston County law enforcement officer with 34 years in the sheriff's office. He was highly decorated. He won the most awards for anyone in Thurston County. He worked his way up to positions of increasing authority, including homicide detective, chief criminal deputy, lieutenant captain, and undersheriff. His accomplishments are very, very long. And the bio was stressed to emphasize not so much his individual achievements, but to establish his history of service in law enforcement and his leadership, his role as a respected member of the community, as opposed to what he was called by the media as some nut whose cheese slid off his cracker when he worked on the Paul Ingram ritual abuse case. So that is simply not the case. Neil had stated, and that was the first thing he wanted to get across, is that when he started out and he was exposed to satanic ritual abuse in a legal case, in a criminal justice investigation, he didn't know what it was, and he didn't believe the survivors. And that was one of his main things he wanted me to share with you, is that he continues to apologize on behalf of himself and the law enforcement community who did not believe survivors at first, because they did not have the capacity to see outside of their own box at how dismal things can actually be for children. And now he is an ardent believer in the reality, the sick reality of satanic ritual abuse. So things started for Neil McClanahan back in the 70s when he was a policeman and he got reports of quote-unquote demon worship or demonology. He had reports of fires in fields and pastures in rural areas, that there were people that were gathered around for animal mutilations.
Hey, brother. Hey.
Animal carcasses were found and they were mutilated without blood. And there were animals. Now, I wanted to say that this is a trigger warning, so I should have started that already. We are getting into a criminal justice investigation report related to satanic ritual abuse. There will be things shared that are detailed and horrific. So if that is not something that you want to hear, definitely stop this video now. You can go for a walk if you're here and come back. We're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty, because that's how we educate people about what really happens to children and what really faces law enforcement officers who are called to investigate things. So they would go out into the fields and try to investigate why they were finding animals with sexual organs removed and no blood remaining. And Neil was really curious, he was confused, he started reading books on the subject. And some books were so rare he had to find them in a special room and read them while supervised to prevent the theft of the books. He read about demonology, demon conjuring on special occasions, trying to understand the mindset of perpetrators who would mutilate animals. He met with veterinarians to discuss the cases, and sometimes the results seemed rather mundane. In other words, it was the neighbors who called the police on their neighbors, and when they looked into it, they looked at it was maybe animal slaughter, maybe the animal was found dead because the cattle had eaten a plastic bag and the stomach was twisted and the animal grew sick and died. The genitals were removed because other animals came and they would eat soft tissue first, so it's kind of gross, but that's just the world. And so the conclusion at first was, well, maybe these are natural causes, or just things that are happening in the world, not necessarily organized ritual harm of animals. But gradually there began to be more information. So an example of an exception case, they found a bull with its penis surgically removed and there was no blood left in the bull. So after autopsy, they found a rifle bullet in the bull's head. So this case was an exception. It was like, wait a minute, this is not natural causes. There's people who are firing the bullet. There's surgical removal of genitals of an animal. So what's going on here? So it moved from animals to people, and this was in 1988. So this was a case that took place in Washington State, our home state, in '88. So Neil McClanahan had gone to a benefit at something called Safe Place, which was a rape relief and domestic violence advocacy group that law enforcement occasionally worked with. And Neil had built a rapport with them over time. And Missy M. was a tough Armenian woman, and she was a staff member of Safe Place. And one day she goes up to Neil McClanahan, and Neil's not here so you can't see. He's a kind of a tall, burly guy. He probably looks like central casting, police undersheriff. And she goes up to him and she says, what if there was a high-ranking law enforcement officer who was doing horrible things, horrible crimes against children and others for a long period of time, and the victims were so horribly traumatized and terrified they would not be believed, and they were fearful there'd be a cover-up if they talked about who was actually abusing them, because it's someone high up in law enforcement. What do we do? Now, Neil McClanahan's answer is still very, very appropriate to this day. What Neil suggested, if someone had a report of satanic ritual abuse that was perpetrated by high-ranking officials, is that what they would do is document exactly what happened and make this report in writing simultaneously to all levels of an agency and the outside agency at the same time, and to CC every single agency that was reported to. So everyone would know that everybody else was informed. And hopefully that would prevent a cover-up, because you have both the agency where the accused was working, but you also have an outside agency to help hold them accountable. Well, on not too long after that, on Monday, November 28th, 1988, the agency that Missy had hypothetically described was in fact the place that Neil McClanahan worked, the Thurston County Sheriff's Office, and the high-ranking member was Paul Ingram, a co-worker of Neil McClanahan. Paul Ingram's role at the time was Chief Civil Deputy, and he had been appointed by the sheriff of the sheriff's office. It was the fourth highest ranking office in the department, and his duties include officer of the court. So he could issue evictions and deal with state issues, warrants, emergency services, missing persons, etc. So this was a man with a lot of power. Paul Ingram was a 16-year veteran of the police force. He was the former chair of the Thurston County Republican Party in Olympia, Washington. He was heavily involved in politics. He once ran for the office of state representative and was defeated by a narrow margin. Paul Ingram was a father of 5, and he grew up in Spokane, Washington. One of his daughters was deprived of oxygen and handicapped in her childhood. She was living in an institution in Spokane. She eventually died. His wife, Sandy, was a former school board member of the Tumwater School District, and she ran a daycare center out of her house. Paul shared a car on different shifts with Neil McClanahan. They both lived in East Olympia, and he knew their... So this idea that perpetrators of satanic ritual abuse may be people that they're far out there and you've never heard of them, that's not necessarily the case. These may be people that you know, that you're working with. They may be friends, or if they may be your neighbors, they may be your coworkers. So looking back on the case, Neil had learned about dissociation. So dissociation is the traumatic reaction to something that overwhelms the human nervous system. I call it the fight, flight, or freeze reaction, the freeze and float. So we dissociate when we cannot process what's happened to us. And children are far more likely to dissociate than adults because they have less coping mechanisms. And therefore, as Neil McClanahan learned about dissociation, and then he thought back to his interviews of Paul Ingram's children, he recognized the symptoms of dissociation in those children. At the time, he called it the 20-mile stare. The children would not interact with adults, but he didn't understand. They thought they were shy because he was a police officer. But now he realized that they were horrifically abused and traumatized, and that's why. So on November 28th, Neil McClanahan and the sheriff prepared to confront their coworker, Paul Ingram, for allegations of child sexual abuse. Paul's daughters had disclosed to their mother, Sandy, to Safe Place Shelter, and to the Church of Living Water that they intended to report the abuse to the police. They then escaped the home while Paul, the father, and Sandy, the mother, and the youngest son were on vacation on the Oregon coast. The daughters were moved out of the house into a safe house, which was appropriate. Members of their church had told Sandy and Paul that they were going to be reported, and Paul was asked to come into the sheriff's office. He was read his rights, he accepted his rights, and he signed, and he was read his waiver of rights and signed them away. Paul had a gun in a holster on his ankle, and his hand was slowly sliding toward his gun. Neil McClanahan put his hand on Paul's hand and removed the gun for safety. Paul was informed of the allegations of sexual abuse, and his first response was, "I taught my daughters not to lie, so if my daughters need help, so will my sons. I don't remember doing this. I don't think I did this, but maybe there's a dark side of me." Wow. He said he'd been praying during his vacation and seemed to be confessing his atrocities. He was immediately relieved of duty during the investigation, placed on administrative leave. He asked to see detectives, special investigations of sexual abuse. He asked to see a minister. He began then the disclosure of horrific abuse of his daughters and sons. So we had an instant confession.
Wow.
Neil McClanahan then talked to Paul's daughters to witness their allegations. Again, Neil apologizes to survivors of satanic ritual abuse for early on not believing and questioning their stories, and not taking them seriously or understanding the dissociation and other effects of abuse. So again, a trigger warning if you're listening, this may be hard to hear. The daughters shared allegations of ritual abuse, ceremonies, Paul impregnating one of the daughters through rape, who was examined by an MD. The doctor deemed that she was indeed medically evidenced to have been pregnant, though there was no baby. Paul said the baby was taken away by an abortion in a clinic in Sheldon, Washington, though there was no places in 1988 in Sheldon that were known to perform abortions. The daughter recalled that the baby was taken in a ritualized ceremony, that the mother, at first Sandy, she said that the mother was not involved, but later that she had indeed prepared the children for the rituals, though had not participated in them. After the daughters were brought to therapy, someone broke into the therapist's office, killed the office cat by slitting its throat, spread the blood in a circle in the entryway, and stole the files of his daughters. The sons, when interviewed, talked about witches and demons. They believed whenever they tried to talk about the case, the witches and demons would harass or abuse them even further. They couldn't or wouldn't testify. When interviewed, one son would not talk, would not make eye contact. He would drool. When the interview was over, he would say he had no memories of anything and did not believe the investigations. But again, these are signs of severe trauma. Reports of rituals held regularly in the Olympia area started to trickle into the investigation. That Olympia, in fact, had a reputation of being a location where Satanists gathered to harm others. But most of the victims were horrifically traumatized, so they would not go on record if they were making reports. He said the children especially were the most horrifically traumatized of any victims he had ever seen. When he interviewed the daughters again, they reported that in the middle of the night they would be brought in outdoors or indoors and used in ceremonies with horrific abuse. They would be raped by several men, women with a dildo. They were defecated on. They were given an animal, a puppy or a kitten to bond to, and then the animal was killed in a ceremony. And the victims were told it was their fault that the animal had died. This was conditioning them to the organized ritual abuse system of secrecy and deep shame and terror if they ever told anyone. This is called forced, it's the witness of atrocities. Children are also made to kill animals and other children as a way of forcing them to perpetrate, and then told it's their fault. And they're also told if they ever tell anyone that they're going to be turned over to the police. So it takes away the context of the organized network and just blames it all on the children. And it's a way of keeping children quiet. So Neil talked with Paul again about the allegations of his children. And Paul would meet with a pastor to pray, discern, and talk about the abuse, the torture of children, and animal sacrifices. More children were brought forth into the investigation. They were reported of part of the abuse outside the family. However, there was no convictions related to the larger circle of child abuse. Paul Ingram's defense team engaged the press as part of his defense, and that's when the case went crazy. The term satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, was coined, and the news media went bonkers, according to Neil. He realized that his team was in way over their head. They had no idea what they were doing as soon as the press started to hound them for interviews. According to Neil, the news media was overwhelming. This story made the front page of newspapers, lead stories on local news. Channel 5 did a story called Sons of Satan. They were trying to find the exact location of a quote-unquote portal to hell that brought the demons forward to begin all of this. And there was helicopters flying over, and suddenly the investigative journalists and media started talking to other victims of the case. They became confused. The newscasters took stories and ran with them that were not necessarily true, and it caused a tremendous amount of confusion in the case. The local news media were contacted by their national news organizations, and finally they were called to knock it off in terms of so much inflammatory reporting, and so the hype eventually died down. But Thurston County dealt with the hype by separating out from the ritual abuse angle. They didn't know how to prosecute against ritual abuse cases, and what they realized is it was not against the law to put on robes and dance around a fire, or even kill one's own animal, or try to conjure demons. This was not against the law. So they focused on the child sexual abuse portion of the case, which was against the law. And they brought in outside consultants to help work on the case. But this case, according to Neil, took its toll on everyone involved, including the investigators, and they got really no support or emotional debriefing or backup.
Jeez.
I'm going to do a shorter summary of some of the consultation that was brought into the case, and just say that there were two people that were brought in to try to advise the police about how to deal with the dynamics of satanic ritual abuse. And one of the individuals brought in was someone named Richard Offshee, who was a sociologist that interviewed the victims. And during the interviews, the victims would crawl under the table, they would hide in a corner, they struggled to answer questions, but after a while, Offshee earned their trust. And the investigators were hopeful that Offshee could help them and help the whole situation. However, what Offshee proposed to do was to talk with Paul and tell him that the idea for ritual perpetration was just caused by the sons. The detectives did not want him to do that, feeling it would confuse the case, but he did it anyway. So suddenly his behavior was starting to make no sense. They later found out that Offshee had a hidden agenda. He wanted to create reasonable doubt for guilt by asserting that Paul Ingram was a victim, and he had turned the tables on the police. He accused the police of lying and of being crazy, and he accused the victims of lying and being crazy, and according to Neil, he decimated the victims. So he turned on the victims. And another psychologist who reviewed the case said it was the worst action she'd ever seen by a helping professional towards survivors. Neil McClanahan believed it was intended by Offshee to make a name for himself by discrediting the victims and shifting the blame from Paul Ingram to the detectives for planting ideas. Now, that is the behavior of someone who is sent in as an operative working for the organized abuse network. So that kind of a thing where people don't necessarily know how to deal with it, they bring in professionals, and it turns out the professionals were hired by the abuse network. That's something to really watch for in legal cases and criminal justice cases, is to be highly protective of anyone you let close to the victims. So in this case, was it a lone perpetrator? Well, according to Neil, two other individuals were charged in a case. Another police officer, a detective in the sex crimes unit, and a mechanic neighbor of Paul Ingram. So there was at least 3 perpetrators plus Paul and his wife that were alleged to have been involved. But the conviction was only accomplished with Paul Ingram. So they were not able to make the other charges stick. By the time the people were named by Paul and the victims, when questioned, interestingly, the other alleged perpetrators said the exact same thing that Paul originally said. They said, "I don't remember doing that, but maybe I have a dark side." So that language indicates the possible presence of dissociation, or what has become to be called dissociative identity disorder. Some people refer to it as a front life, the front-facing life that we might see in the community, and a back life that can be trained by the cult to perpetrate acts, and the front life is not conscious of what the back consciousness is doing. That is the essence of trauma-based mind control, and it's a very common presentation in victims. However, as mentioned, they were not able to get enough evidence to prosecute those other alleged perpetrators. So, Paul Ingram pled guilty to 12 counts of child sexual abuse, particularly his daughters. After his pleas, Judge Peterson ordered Paul Ingram to talk and plead to specific child abuse with details, dates, and times. This was all documented in the court, which did not focus on the ritualized or occult nature of the crimes. So one thing I found was fascinating is that in my investigations of the internet today, I found still a ton of disinformation facing the public. So what is true, and this is a first-hand account of the officer who was there, is that Paul made detailed confessions. It was documented by the court and entered into evidence. So Paul Ingram did not remain consistent with his confession. There's some speculation that he was accessed by his grandmother, who may have been involved in the satanic cult, or others had somehow gotten to him. But he changed his mind, and he said that he wanted to vacate his pleas and claimed that he confessed under duress. Basically, his attorney tried to turn the tables on the investigation to suggest that the police had victimized Paul due to their own ambition. This is a common kind of defense to go on the offense. And Afshi, who is still involved, brought up the scenario of the Ingram boys being involved in the abuse of the sisters, and he was trying to convince the judge that it was not Paul Ingram, it was the boys. But the judge's response was that Afshi was not correct, and he called him strident in his testimony and involvement. So some investigators got involved to look at the vacate of plea case, and it was taken all the way to Pierce County. But the judge denied Paul's attempts to vacate his pleas. During, another story that Neil McClanahan tells of the case is when he was driving in the car with Paul Ingram. Paul was in handcuffs and shackles, and he was being taken into custody. And as they went by Fort Lewis, he looked at an overpass, and there was a man in a gray robe standing there holding a giant cross. So Neil wasn't sure what that meant, but he thought it was an odd synchronicity. At the final sentencing, one of Paul's daughters brought a letter and said she received it from Paul, threatening to kill them if he was convicted. But it was some confusion about who actually wrote the letter. So the judge decided that it was not derail the case, the fact that this was confusing. So the result overall of the case is that Paul Ingram was convicted of 3 times the penalty that he was originally assigned. He was deemed one of the worst offenders they had ever talked to, a psychotic sociopath without remorse or regard for the victims, and he was sentenced to 20 years, the maximum of sentencing guideline, for child sexual assault of children. His good time release was 13 years, after which he would be eligible for release. He served 14 and a half years in prison. At parole hearing, the horrors of the crime prohibited his early release. And after conviction, he began a process with his sisters to appeal the case. The first appeal was unsuccessful, as mentioned. He appealed again. It was taken to the Appellate Court of Washington. He sought a new trial and was denied. His then appeal was to the Supreme Court of Washington, which was denied. And then the case was appealed at the Appellate Court of Western Washington to look at individual civil rights. Again, it was denied. The next level was the 9th District Federal Court of the Western United States in San Francisco. This is the most liberal court in the land, the most to conflict with the U.S. Supreme Court. They denied appeal. The reason that Neil went into all the detail about these appeals is to make sure, if you read something online, that you know that this was a rock-solid case. it was denied all the appeals. At that point, this stopped the appeal process. It did not go up to the Supreme Court. And it was applied for the Clemency Board for dismissal. But at this hearing, Chad Ingram, one of Paul's sons, who had not been able to speak before, stood up in the audience and talked about the past. He had apparently healed enough to say, no, it was not true that my dad was tricked into false allegations. My dad was a monster. I am in fear of my life. I was too traumatized to talk about it before due to conditioning and horror. But he is an evil man and he should not be granted clemency. And so the clemency was denied. So that would be an example of a child who worked through their healing enough to stand up and say no and speak up on their own behalf. So that is the story of Neil McClanahan and the Paul Ingram case. And he clarified that what he had learned is the children involved in the case were not dealing with repressed memories. So some people say, well, if you've been abused so much, you have repressed memories. And he said, no, these children always recalled what had happened to them, but they were too afraid to talk about it due to threats and horror. He said what he learned is that this form of abuse, satanic ritual abuse, is caused by design. It's designed for physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and sexual harm to horrifically traumatize individuals and keep them from revealing who was guilty of the crimes. When survivors try to escape the abuse and reveal their secrets, they're then attacked of their credibility. So many people are so overwhelmed and horrified, like Neil was at first, they don't believe them. Or the victims are it's hard for them to articulate because they can't find the language to talk about what happened, or it is so overwhelming. So survivors are conditioned to believe that no one will believe them and that God has forsaken them and there's no beneficent God outside the ritualized distortion of it. But healing can happen with survivors. And I'm here to say that's the case, and our next speaker is going to be talking with you much more about this. So even though this is a very painful case to listen to and witness, it actually is true that there are benevolent sources and places of support for victims to go to, no matter what happened to them, that if they can find people to trust and perhaps disclose to multiple people, they will find some safe people who can believe them. In Neil McClanahan's experience talking with survivors, he hears them talk about difficulties with holidays. Often certain days are ritual abuse holidays, and that's a way that they have struggles with family gatherings. So they have horrible memories and triggers on this day. A difference between people who are psychotic and survivors of ritualized abuse who see demons is that when survivors talk about seeing demons, if they can work through this, they actually can do better. Survivors need to be listened to and believed. And since the time of this case, Neil has actually met with dozens of survivors. He's talked with survivors all over the world who reach out to him as a criminal justice professional. Now he is retired. And he's gone into psychiatric hospitals to meet with survivors and say, I believe you, and you are credible, and you can heal from this. And so I just wanted to conclude by saying thank you very much to Neil McClanahan. I hope that you are feeling better soon, and so sorry that you couldn't be with us today, but thank you for your detailed notes about the Paul Ingram case, for your amazing work back in the late 80s and ever since to help survivors. And may there be many, many more criminal justice professionals in the Seattle Police and in police departments all over the world who could benefit from this information, from your process of education, and start at a much higher level of awareness because of your sharing this story and me being able to share it thanks to you, so that when these cases start coming in, that police know what they're dealing with. They have the capacity to protect the victims and not expose them to tampering and outside access. And they're able to focus in on the areas of the case that they can do something about. Also, I do believe, the last thing I'll say is that we need to get ritual abuse of children into our legal system as illegal. because ritual abuse is an added level of harm to children, and it should be written into the books as such so that people can be prosecuted beyond just the statutes of child sexual abuse. So, thank you very much for that particular part of our evening, and thanks to Neil McClanahan for your story.
Thank you, Anastasia.
You are welcome. Okay, so now we are moving on to our second portion of the evening, our second speaker, after which we will begin our march through the Seattle Center and through the city.
Yeah.
So, our next speaker is a survivor of satanic ritual and other organized extreme abuse. Alandra Markman is someone who moved to Seattle not too terribly long ago, but you might be able to find him at the West Seattle Farmers Market, crafting evocative poems for passersby. Alandra is a poet and poet instructor. He is a dancer and dance instructor. He is an artist and musician, an incredibly talented writer, and someone who I respect very much. And I am deeply grateful that he's willing to come. You know, one of the things that Neil McClanahan shared is that there has been harassment of him. And it is a risk to go public. It is not a simple decision that just anybody makes. The courage required to go public and share one's story is really amazing in my opinion. And so I, without further ado, would like to welcome Alandra Markman to come and talk with you about his story. And welcome, Alandra.
One, two. Hello. I'm the person who was just described.
Hello.
Now I'm standing here in real time, and I could describe myself, I guess. I was mostly described. Yeah, I'm a poet and a musician and some stuff like that. I like a creative process. I like to be in the creative process. That's really my main happiness and harmony in life. So that was a good way to introduce me, thanks. It also so happens that I am a survivor of satanic ritual abuse and many other forms of trauma-based mind control. That's actually a very broad category, which includes a lot of different things. But I should start somewhere near the beginning. So my family is a multi-generational satanic ritual abuse family. This is the case for a lot of survivors. These things tend to run in families. There's often also a connection with major institutions and governmental entities. So the case of Paul Ingram implicates the Thurston County Sheriff's Department and Police Department in Washington. In my case, there are quite a few three-letter organizations involved. So, to name a few of these, the CIA is a big obvious one. They've been participating in satanic ritual abuse since at least the 1930s, probably earlier, and in my personal experience, which starts in the 1980s onward. Also, Air Force intelligence was a big perpetrator in my life. So the CIA, Air Force intelligence, the New York City Police Department was also a major part of my abuse. And this kind of satanic ritual abuse is planned and perpetrated at the very highest levels of leadership within the New York City Police Department and other major police departments around the country and around the world. So there's a very big tie-in, unfortunately, with parts of the military, especially the intelligence communities, so-called intelligence communities. Military intelligence, as the joke goes, is an oxymoron. So I like to say that. But yeah, it goes unfortunately to the very top of many different organizations. My whole life, my birth, most of my experience of my life has been very, very meticulously organized by some of these organizations. So, yeah, I guess I'll just start. Well, also, I'm going to just start with this body, this birth. There's actually abuse that goes beyond that, which I cover in some other places, notably James Rink's Super Soldier Talk YouTube channel. So I talk about some of the abuse even before this body came in. A lot of the abusers are working on greater than physical levels, and so this abuse is perpetrated way beyond the physical. There's spiritual abuse, and there's dislocation in time and space with advanced technology, and that all gets very complicated. I want to keep it relatively simple right now, so I'm just going to focus on the ritual abuse components and leave out some of the trippy sci-fi so-called material. But that's also part of my story. Yeah, you can check out James Rink's channel if you want to get started with that kind of information. So I was born, or this body was created in a breeding facility. So the CIA and groups like Air Force Intelligence have breeding programs for human beings. They're basically cattle raising programs. So just the same way that we raise cattle, you know, bulls, pigs, cows, there are human beings being raised under those kinds of conditions as livestock. So I just want to say that and take a moment with that, because it's very sobering, to say the least. And it's very tempting to dissociate right away and to not believe the rest of anything that I say. So I just want to take a moment, because I just said that there are large-scale breeding programs of human beings where they're raised like cattle in our country, in the United States. So
Wow.
that's big. My personal body came about through these breeding programs. So my mother was a breeder. She had many, many children against her will through rape. And she was kept at many different breeding facilities that were maintained by the CIA and Air Force Intelligence. The particular one I was born at was west of Topeka, Kansas. Topeka is the capital of Kansas. Often the state capital regions and legislative branch of government, well, all the branches have pretty heavy ties with satanic ritual abuse organizations. So it was Olympia, Washington was mentioned earlier. I just want to also mention Topeka, Kansas. So this breeding facility was a little bit west of Topeka, and I was one of many children. My mother had children throughout her life, and really up until she passed, she was being sexually trafficked. So that in and of itself, again, is a very horrible part of the story, but you know, she was being used, again, in a very similar way that that a mare might be used to breed horses, along similar principles, and much less humane than what happens with horses. So I was one of many children. I had a twin brother. I have a lot of half-siblings as well, brothers and sisters, who, unfortunately, I've never had the chance to meet most of them. But the children are bred for various things. Just like in horses, we might look for power or speed or beauty. In people, oftentimes the abusers are looking for different kinds of gifts that they can exploit. So in my case, I tested very high for psychic ability and creative ability and intuition, empathy. So these are skills that run in families. You know, I come from an artist family. Everybody in my artist family is pretty much some sort of creative person. Yeah, my mother was a pianist and a writer, just like me. My father, biological father, is a painter and a musician and a poet. And this goes back in my family a long time, and I could go on about that. I come from a very powerful creative family with roots in the Southwest U.S. and Eastern Europe that has been tied in with the satanic groups for many, many generations. My bloodline is very, very highly valued as well. So my skills are valued. My skills as a creative, sensitive person are valued. And then also my bloodline is highly valued. Allegedly, I have ancestors among the Merovingians of France. So these are royalty of Europe. And so my bloodline is very sought out by the abusers. They're very superstitious. And they seek out, like breeders of animals, they seek certain heritage among people, and they privilege people with those heritage, with those kinds of backgrounds, those kinds of bloodlines. And so that's part of why I'm standing before you, because my body was considered very, very valuable. Although I've been on the brink of death many times, I've kept this body and managed to stay here, and part of that is because the genetic material that I carry is very valued by the perpetrators. There's a lot of stuff to get into here, a lot of little side things. I'll try to keep it moving. And of course, it probably goes without saying that this is all like senselessly traumatic to even begin to talk about, so I'm navigating that internally as well. So just to say that, but thanks. I appreciate your support. So yeah, I was bred at this facility in Kansas. I was brought, shortly after birth, I was brought over to Virginia outside of DC and tested for various things. They have means to test even infants for different skills and for different bloodlines. So generally speaking, the Satanist practitioners of organized abuse are, they practice Solomonic magic, which means they're looking for descendants of King Solomon. So basically, I'm considered a descendant of Solomon. And for certain black magic purposes, you need somebody with his blood to complete the ritual. So again, it's all very superstitious, but it's part of how they operate. So I was brought to Virginia outside Pentagon. There's a sports game across the street. It's very funny. I tested into certain things, and I was brought after that to New York City. And most of my growing up was at various military facilities and bases, but in what I call my front life, my legal, in terms of my legal existence, my birth certificate says I was born in New York. A few days after my actual birth, it says, legally I have no brothers or sisters. I was raised by a single mother. So my legal existence is very, very different from my actual experience. And that's partly because those records are heavily manipulated by the perpetrators, which is very sad and disorienting. Anyway, so I grew up in New York with my mother. I mean, that is true. I was also brought all over the country and all over the world and even off planet for some of this abuse to take place. So I'll stay focused in New York. From an early age, I was put into educational programs for bright and gifted children. This is a very common way for people who have been selected for their gifts to be trained and trauma trained. They're brought into different programs that are supposed to be for highly intelligent, highly gifted children. There's some relationship to actual IQ and more conventional testing of children, but not very much of a relationship. It's really more based on bloodlines. So from an early age, I went to exclusive private schools that my single mother would never be able to afford, but it was sponsored by the cult. Supposedly, I have a series of scholarships that I got growing up, and even back to pre-K, I was selected for more advanced education. I went to very expensive private schools. So I'm very privileged in a conventional sense. while that was going on, I also received a lot of trauma-based mind control training, and that was at the hands of members of all these different agencies that I'm mentioning, in particular the New York City Police Department, and I also had private trainers, tutors they were called, ironically, who would basically break down my mind, force me to create different personalities. I was forced to be fractured into dozens of different personalities. So I developed dissociative identity disorder, which is what it's called when they break up your mind into different personalities for different purposes. And my front life alters would do very well at these, at these special private schools. I would always get very good grades and never make trouble. And at the same time, I had other alters who were very, very split off from my primary consciousness, who were taught to expect and accept pain at all times, of every description. So I went through physical assault, sexual assault, emotional and spiritual assault, anything that can be done to a human body was basically done to my body at one point or another. And I don't need to go into all the gory details around that. But to give one small graphic example, which kind of gives you a sense of the depth of the physical torture, and here's a trigger warning if you don't want to deal with physical torture, but I'll just briefly mention I've had most of the major bones in my body broken and healed by the perpetrators. I've had electroshocks throughout my body, applied by diodes and transmitters and cattle prods and many other methods. Being in water with low voltage electricity running through all sorts of different diabolical things, quite literally diabolical. I was on all sorts of drugs, psychiatric drugs, recreational drugs, drugs that are only used by the military and are not available to the public, are not available to psychiatry, were used on me, so chemical torture as well. Just to name some different categories and give you an idea of how gruesome this actually is. The sexual abuse was in every conceivable category. One of the most devastating to me psychologically was incest with my mother, which I was forced to go through for many, many years. So I'll name that. And then all kinds of rape, different perpetrators. Male and female, and even animal and non-human. So just to give you, again, I'm not going to go into specific experiences, but even just to tell you the categories of abuse is gut-wrenching. I was also bred to be a killer, and I've killed many other human beings. Not by choice, but because I was coerced to do so. And I was trained for that. I was trained to murder other people. So I actually had tutors that were specifically for that, specifically for learning how to kill other human beings. I fought in cage matches with other children, and the fact that I'm standing here tells you that I won, unfortunately. Or fortunately. There are many, many people whose lives were sacrificed so that I could be standing here before you. And I'll just leave it at that. That's probably enough of a review of horrible torture. So I was raised in this extremely sadistic fashion and made into a killer myself, and made into a rapist myself, and forced into all sorts of abuse, receiving and giving. Many different perpetrators, many different people, and yeah, some of the most devastating were with my own family. And everything I've described for myself is also true for the other people that I witnessed in the program. It's true for my siblings and half-siblings. It's true for my parents. My mother, I saw another form of torture is being forced to witness others, so I had to witness my mother going through a lot of these things and worse things. All right, let me try to stop talking about that. Although it needs to be talked about too, so I mean, I need to give some context about what's actually happening, because it's barbaric beyond anything that we're taught to believe is possible. It's really on another level of depravity that that you have to be trained into. I mean, even the most sociopathic person, without this kind of training, they never get to this level of depravity. It requires extremely organized training and very, very high levels of discipline. This is military level discipline, and it's done by the military, sometimes, quite often. There's an unholy alliance between the traditional Satanists, especially of Europe, and the military and law enforcement. Historically, these were more separated, but in the last few generations, they've been collaborating, and so there's the black magic component, which goes back a very, very long time to the very roots of Western civilization. So those people we call Satanists have been around for as long as there have been any other Western religious sect. Christianity, a lot of Satanism is inverted Christianity, and a lot of what we experience as Christianity is basically Satanism for the masses, and that's a whole other topic. But so so that's one stream, and then there's also the military intelligence and police community stream of things, which increasingly they've been using the techniques of Satanists on children, and sometimes in a traditional religious context and sometimes not. But I experienced both sides of that. So I was trained, I was trained to be, an artist in my front life and a killer in my back life. As you can imagine, there's extreme cognitive dissonance associated with that. And there are parts of myself that I've had to bring into awareness. Some of them were never even taught to speak. As you can hear, I sound like an educated person. I'm a writer. And also within myself, I have personalities who are barely able to speak at all, to use language even in the most basic way. So just to give an example of how far apart these personalities can be in their abilities and their experience. So some of those killer parts are just learning to speak, and I have to speak for them, because some of us would never be able to stand here and talk to you. So it's a very gradual process of integrating all those alters. And I'm sure other survivors who are hearing this will resonate with that. As I got older, I was used as a breeder myself, and this is also some of the most horrific abuse that I've been through. I have fathered many, many children through rape. So I'm the father of over 300 children that I'm consciously aware of. Because as soon as I hit puberty, I was being used as a breeder, and I was being set up with different women of all descriptions to try to impregnate them. So I was put on steroids, I was put on hormones, I was fed many genitals of animals to kind of feed back to what was mentioned in the Paul Ingram case. It's a very intense bodily experience to go through all this. It makes your sex drive just drown out everything else. So I was being used for rapes. I was being raped, or I was raping others, depending on how you look at it. Both were true. Constantly. There were times when I was removed from my home and kept for weeks at a designated breeding facility. I was brought up to many different ones. One of them that stands out was in central Mexico, in the state of Jalisco. I was brought down there many times, and for weeks on end, I would be in an altered state of consciousness on many different drugs, and basically constantly raped. Constantly, for days on end, for weeks on end. If I would fall asleep, I would be shocked awake and have to do it again. So that was, we need a bigger word than traumatic, because it's much, much more than that. It's soul shattering. So I'm the father of many children that I've never had the privilege of meeting, as far as I'm aware. Some of them were sacrificed and, as they say, sacrificed and killed. Others were adopted to different cult families, and so they were brought up in situations probably not unlike my growing up. So some of them are dead, some of them have been adopted. Some of them are in military service, and they're kept in underground bases of the CIA in particular. And some of them don't even have legal identities. They never receive birth certificates, so their entire life is a secret from the public. I know that was the case for some of my siblings as well, and it's something that really breaks my heart. So yeah, as soon as I hit puberty, I was forced to be in the breeding programs and create more slaves. In my case, that was when I was 12, turning 13. So basically, as soon as I could impregnate women, I was being made to do so, and that continued regularly from 13 to 16. So you can imagine, with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rapes during that time, I have a lot of children. That's something I'm in the process of healing. Well, this is also stuff that I'm in the process of healing. When I reached the age of 16, turning 17, I got to a point where they wanted to recruit me for higher level work. So I wasn't meant to be just a breeder, I was actually meant to be a leader in the satanic organizations. But I reached a breaking point. I attempted suicide and tried to take myself out of the loop of torture. There's a whole convoluted series of events which I'm intending to hopefully write about in the near future, to tell that part of the story about how I got out. But basically, my body was too valuable to them to let it die, and I discovered that when I tried to kill myself, and I wasn't allowed to. So it really showed me that they placed a very high value on this body as a very valuable form of livestock, and they wanted to recruit me into leadership positions, but I refused. I refused for over a year, until basically the exact circumstances I'm still kind of bringing into my consciousness. I'm a very spiritual person, and my spiritual guides tell me, so this part requires a bit of belief, but my spiritual guides tell me that I raised my vibration to the point where I couldn't be enslaved anymore. So that's a spiritual thing, and it's a consciousness thing, and it's very subtle, and that's something that I like to talk about and think about a lot. So according to my spiritual guides, I had raised my vibration to the point where I couldn't be enslaved. My 3D experience was that basically I went on strike. I made it clear that I would kill myself if they made me continue, and they consider my body too valuable to do that. So they agreed to release me. Well, I say agreement, it wasn't an agreement. It eventually became clear that they would release me. But what they would do first is try to wipe my memory. So I went through a very, very difficult period, about 8 or 9 months, during the last part of my enslavement, when anything and everything was done to basically target my long-term memory in my brain. And I'm not very well versed in neuroscience, so I'm not going to go into specifics of brain areas, but what I gather is that the long-term memory aspects of my brain were specifically targeted with electroshock and chemicals and many other strategies to try to obliterate my memories. And I was subjected to torture even worse than anything I'd been through before. So when I was released, I was about 17, and I had almost no memory of, well, who I was, what was going on, what had happened. I went back to my single mother in New York City, and basically kind of had to piece my life together a little bit from scratch at that point. I mean, I remembered enough to function amazingly, but some pretty heavy abuse and brain damage. But I'm a big believer in neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to heal itself and reorganize and create new neural pathways. I feel like I'm living proof of that. So, and that's been part of my healing journey too. Anyway, so I got out of the cult and away from the 3-letter organizations when I was about 17, and circumstances were created to get me away from my blood family, thankfully, and I wound up with essentially a foster family. A friend of mine in high school, his family took me in, and I stayed with them, and I got away from my family. And eventually I cut ties with my mother. She committed suicide very recently, just last month, which is actually really helping me start to talk about this in greater detail. And that's another story about her, but I know she's in a better place, and it does help me to speak out about things. I know her spirit supports me doing this. So I'll just wrap up the rest of my story to the present. So I was in a very confused state, as you might imagine, and pretty suicidal, and really not sure of who I was or what was happening from 17 to 19, but I made my way through. I was accepted to different colleges for some, I don't know how that happened, but my front alters were still doing very well in school and all that stuff. So I went to college, and but I was feeling extreme self-hatred and extreme pain all the time, and I was quite suicidal. It took me a few years to kind of find my footing. When I was 19, I started getting into meditation, and that was very, very helpful to me. That's been one of the main practices that's helped me find my ground and start on a healing journey. So started going to Quaker meetings, which were really lovely, and then started going to Buddhist meetings, and did some pretty intense training in a Zen Buddhist context for some years. In my early 20s, I traveled all around studying with different meditation teachers. I was hitchhiking around the country. One of the positive parts about my experience is that it left me with a sense of really nothing to lose, and so I had adventures, and I felt very courageous because I just felt like I couldn't go any lower. So I had a lot of adventures. I hitchhiked all around the US and Canada, and was just desperately trying to find my center and find myself. And I studied with different, mostly Buddhist teachers across the country, and I was making art because I could never help making art. It just is too deep in me to resist, and that's just really part of who I am. So I was writing and journaling and My writing at first was very abstract, and that's a whole story as well. I was torture trained never to write directly about my experience or to think directly about it, and so poetry became a refuge for me in more ways than one. Creative refuge, but also just a way that I could write without talking directly about my experiences or my feelings. So poetry also has been extremely helpful in grounding, meditation, poetry. These practices I kind of started in my early adulthood when I got free. So started writing more, started meditating. I started writing poetry on a typewriter for other people on the spot, which is what I still do today in West Seattle.
Wow.
Yeah, so I traveled all around with my typewriter. So I've been doing that for almost 18 years now. Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so I've been meditating and doing improvised poetry for, about that time, almost 18 years. And other creative practices have helped me a lot. I've been doing a lot of dance, contact improv dance. I've also been doing for most of that time. And that kind of, helped give me something to live for, which is always nice for human beings, whether or not you have extreme trauma. And then I finally actually went to therapy for the first time in 2013 when I was in my late 20s. I was really scared of therapists for a lot of different reasons. Some of the perpetrators of my abuse were psychiatrists and therapists. And I was subjected to a lot of different procedures that are usually used for the mentally ill. So that's another aspect of the abuse which needs to be talked about as well. Our mental health system, as it now exists, is very, very tied in with organized abuse, which should be pretty much obvious from the way people with severe mental illness are treated. They're held against their will and put through really extreme chemical therapy and electroshock therapy and all that sort of stuff. As a side note, my mother in her front life was very engaged in activism against electroconvulsive therapy. So she actually had her own front life and her own activism, which bears mention. She has a book out called Doctors of Deception, What They Don't Want You to Know About Electroshock Treatment. And I recommend the book. Came out in 2009. Anyway, so I was extremely scared to engage with any sort of mental health professional, and that kept me away for many years. But eventually I found sort of a way into therapy. I found a group. It was kind of in between a peer support and a therapy group that I found when I was going to school in Colorado, Naropa in Boulder, Colorado. I found a wonderful organization called the Wings Foundation, which is headquartered in Denver, Colorado. And I started going to their peer support groups for male survivors of childhood sexual assault. So at that point, I was ready to admit at least that I'd been through sexual assault. All the rest of it I wasn't quite ready to touch yet because it was too insane. Even it just seemed, I felt like I was insane. I had a lot of different memories of all this stuff that I'm mentioning. Anyway, I got to a point where I could at least accept the sexual abuse component. I started going to these peer support meetings, and they were really, really good, really transformative. And after maybe a year of doing those meetings and finding fellowship with other men who were willing to take my trauma seriously and not call me crazy and share their own trauma, and with therapists facilitating the group, I gradually kind of warmed up to maybe going to therapy. Took me a while. So I did eventually find a really lovely trauma treatment center. I moved back to New York. I went to a place called the Crime Victims Treatment Center, which is in Manhattan in New York City, and had some really, really lovely therapy there. Had multiple therapists. I did, again, support groups. I had different individual therapists, and that really opened my mind to a lot of different things. And by that time, I was talking about being trafficked. I was I'd been opening up my story in layers, starting with the more socially acceptable layers, and then going out into the more extreme stuff, which is kind of what I started with. But so at that point, I was just identifying as a trafficking survivor, not talking in detail about any of the military things. And I got some really great therapy kind of on that basis. But it's very, very hard for satanic ritual abuse survivors to get therapy, because if you go in talking openly about your satanic ritual abuse and organized abuse experiences, rape crisis centers, trauma treatment centers, they might turn you away. They might have a very, very hard time even helping you. So this was something that I gradually learned about, and so I was quite guarded actually in how I told my story, and just tried to keep it to a bare minimum, which was another exercise of doublethink, as George Orwell calls it. Triple think, you know, all the different alters collaborating. To get help is a really, really difficult process, because most therapists have no training for this. A lot of them won't even believe you when you tell them. So, but there are, anyway, that gets into some small details. But there are, domestic violence centers, there are rape crisis centers, there are different sexual assault centers, and increasingly trafficking support centers, where survivors can go. But you might have to find that you're a little sparing on the details of your story. But I still recommend therapy. I think it's great. So I went through the different programs at the Crime Victims Treatment Center for a couple of years, 2.5 years. And after that, I feel like I made up a personality from scratch, because all I had were the personalities that the cult had created. And during that process with my meditation and therapy and art, I learned that I could actually create my own personality, which was much preferable. And again, that's another thing, that's a freedom that all humans have, whether or not you have any extreme abuse experience. And that's a freedom that we should all exercise, I think. So yeah, gradually I kind of, when I started at the Crime Victims Treatment Center, I was barely talking in complete sentences, just to give you some context, which might be hard to believe hearing me right now, but that was the case. And over the course of that experience, I started finding my voice and speaking in sentences and paragraphs and all these lovely longer forms of verbiage. Yeah, I also found my voice through doing the poetry exercise. That was really helpful. And I'm really proud of my poetry. It's grown a lot over the years. I was also kind of a way to learn to talk to people, because when I started doing the typewriter poetry exercise, I really wasn't very verbal, but I just kind of forced myself to be on the spot and to, get those verbal centers aligned with what I was feeling, which was a new idea. They were very separate. And my training, my very rigorous training, was to separate those things. But yeah, I've been moving them together more. Anyway, that brings us mostly to the present. I've been doing better and better lately, getting a little more into some of the more intricate trauma, as you can hear as I'm telling you about. I wasn't really able to find any mainstream therapists who were able to help me, but I did find some hypnotherapists who are more open-minded. So that was very helpful to do some hypnotherapy work, which I also recommend. Went through a little bit of quantum healing hypnosis technique, which is Dolores Cannon's hypnotherapy modality. She's really lovely. Recommend all her books, Dolores Cannon. Although she doesn't go into extreme abuse in the books, but a lot of higher consciousness stuff. Anyway, here I am in the present. I teach meditation now. I do energy work with people. I'm a poet and musician, as I mentioned, and that's kind of like who I am in the present. And I'm speaking out about this ritual abuse much more now, trying to encourage myself to write more long-form pieces about it. Of course, I have poems that allude to my experiences, but it's much more subtle, so I want to be more direct, like I am being right now, because that's very helpful. People need to understand the story. They might get the feeling from a poem, but I want them to consciously understand as well. So here I am speaking in a more direct, linear fashion, not talking in poetry, although I'm happy to do so upon request. Also, 2023 is a big year for me of coming out. I went back to one of my biggest torture sites, which was about 3 hours east of New York City in Montauk, New York. I just returned from a trip there a couple months ago with a group to do some healing work. And that was really nice with James Rink's group. He's the guy who has the Super Soldier Talk channel. I've had a very transformative experiences this year. I survived an assassination attempt, so pat on the back. I take that to be a great compliment when you get attacked like that. It means you're doing something right. So it's also inspiration for me to, get out there more, get on more platforms, because, I don't want to die. Unfortunately, when you talk about these things, there are such things as assassination attempts that happen. But I'm here. It's been a really interesting time, a very transformative time, and I'm very happy to be speaking out. And also, there was, if memory serves, I had a gag order, as they call it, from Air Force Intelligence, to not talk about my experiences for 20 years. So, to be honest, I have no idea where that documentation is. I have no idea if that's actually legally binding. But what I know is that my inner parts definitely believed it and took it seriously. There may be paperwork out there somewhere, maybe I'll find it eventually. But whether that was true or false or made up or legal or illegal or whatever, now that 20-year time period has expired because I got free in 2003 and it's 2023. Wow. So I'm feeling much more confident and comfortable speaking out. So here I am doing that. And yeah, that's my presentation.
Wow.
Thanks.
You want to cry? I know. Amazing. I came pretty close to crying.
I'll go the other way.
Okay.
Because it hits home to me.
Thank you so much. Please give another round of applause for Alandra Markman. So the courage required to stand up and tell a story like that is indescribable, and yet we as humans are experiencing it. So we just know it. And so special thank you for that. There is risk, but the rewards also, because there are people out there who are still going through this. Children of all ages and adults, this is still going on. So that is why we are here, and that is why people speak out when they have the courage and they have the level of healing like Alandra does to be able to be articulate about it. This is a very rare opportunity to hear this kind of information. We are I believe we are very blessed. From more knowledge, we can go forward and take a look at what can we do about this. So Alandra mentioned some help that he received. We need so many more services for survivors coming out of these network abuse situations. I will say for Seattle, we have an organization that was founded this year in 2023 that I am a part of. I am a global coach for support for organized abuse and addiction recovery. That is SOAAR Global, and we are informed about organized extreme abuse, and we are here for survivors who are looking for help. And we go to great lengths to find trustworthy people to refer and to network in a positive way. So unfortunately, when people have memories of organized extreme abuse like satanic ritual abuse or trauma-based mind control, they often, if they're out and seeking help, some of the most obvious organizations are unfortunately compromised, because these are not stupid perpetrators. They're aware that people eventually will remember and seek help. And so they put themselves in positions to kind of capture vulnerable people seeking help and then unfortunately reprogram them. So this is just it's a warning for people looking for help. It's important to be careful about where you go, and also bring someone with you to your sessions for a while that you trust. So those are some things that you can do. But at Support for Organized Abuse Addiction Recovery Seattle, or SOAR, we are creating a rehabilitation industry for survivors. It has to do with organic, fresh pressed juice. So this is fresh apple juice. And we're just trying to find ways of engaging people to make money and benefit the community, because one of the biggest problems survivors have to get out of these networks is they don't have any money. They're financially dependent on the cult. They may not have resources outside, which keeps them always going back. So that's one of the ways we support people. So we're going to go into one last brief speaker who is going to talk a bit. This is another sponsor of our event. It's called the Milliontown March, and the creator of this event is Timothy Lassley. Tim is going to come up and talk about that. Many people hearing a story like you just heard with Alandra and some of the account from McClanahan, it can be incredibly shocking, incredibly painful, and yet also inspiring and catalyzing the question of what can I do? Like, if I accept that this is real, I can't sit around. I have to do something. What can I do? So we've got some things that are happening in Seattle and things that are going to be happening in the world. I'm going to introduce Tim Lassley. Tim is a local Seattle activist. He is well known throughout the world for his presentations here at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He is the longest and loudest protester at this location. He is part of what inspired me to create this event and get mobile to do something. And without further ado, one of my inspirations and friends, Tim Lassley.
So I don't know quite how to follow that. I haven't gone through that type of experience, but it sounds like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people are going through that experience, and it's being obscured by the fact that we're in our own world of distraction. We are kept at bay, and we're literally, the things that the Gates Foundation, the things that these entities operate on the surface level are horrible just by what we see in the news, but it sounds like at the subsurface level below that, it's absolutely horrific. And so what I've decided to do is I've tried to figure out a way to make people come to the streets and show us support for truth, and transform the culture from submission and complacency to a culture of resistance, and where children are safe, where parents are informed, and where this type of environment, this type of culture that is obviously lurking everywhere, is exposed and dismantled and destroyed. And I don't really know how to do it. I mean, everybody says we have to take up arms and stuff like that, but I think a peaceful revolution of just understanding people's plights and what they've gone through, and not necessarily being distracted by what they're putting in front of us at a light speed level, but actually being humans to one another, no matter what they've gone through, because we've all gone through some serious trauma. And it's time that we look each other in the eye and understand that it's only going to stop if we unite and if we take, to the streets in a way that it happens. So the Milliontown March, that's what we got to do. It's decentralized. You just go out and you just be a neighbor to your, just go out and be neighbors to one another. Just go out and make a sign and see what happens, because we see what's happening when we don't do anything whatsoever, and it's got to stop. Or, I mean, how do there's no braking system for this anymore unless we do it. So we're the last bastion of hope, hopefully, and we do something about it. So I encourage everybody, say that word a lot, encourage, because you have to talk to yourself inside, and you have to come to grips with the fact that you do have power, and it's not something that it's a very clumsy thing to have. It's a very clumsy notion to believe that you can do something, and it's it's not something you can do right off the bat. You're very imperfect at it, I mean, it's a ragtag thing, but it's the intent and what. I mean, thousands of people can do this overnight. They just have to believe that they have power. So, Alandra has power, Stacy has power, Victoria has power, I've got some power here, but what we all have a tendency to agree when we get in larger groups is that this is the power. And I don't think that has to happen anymore. We just have to encourage people to stand up. So, the Million Town March, or something, because it has to happen. We have to save the children. So, thank you very much.
So, it is now time in the March for Innocence for us to exercise our right to march. We are going to take to the streets in Seattle. We are going to march down 5th Avenue here. We're going to go under the beautiful Seattle Center Space Needle. We're going to walk through and go to the fountain here in Seattle. We're going to carry signs. This is a silent march. So we're not chanting slogans. We are standing in vigil and witness to children across the world who are still being harmed. We're taking a stand for them to be free. This march was inspired by a 1996 march in Belgium, which occurred after a series of child kidnappings and murders, where the community started to recognize that this was an organized extreme abuse network, but nothing was being done at the criminal justice or legislative level. And the community came together basically overnight. This was pre-internet. Word of mouth, people put on white, they took to the streets, and according to many accounts, they had more than 300,000 people come into the streets and take a stand. They called it the Marche Blanche, the White March for Innocence. And that is what inspired us. We don't quite have 300,000 here today, but that is my vision, that we will get there, because humans are good. And when they realize what's truly going on, we will take a stand. We will unite. It's just a matter of time. So that is my vision. So please join with me and with us today. If you're watching this on video, you can conduct your own march. We'll be back every year on October 20th. And the Million Town Marches, though, are not annually. Those are going to be taking place much more frequently because we need to act now. So if you're interested in information, you can look up themilliontownmarch.com. You can look up SOAAR Global, SOAAR Global.com. You can look up Poetry by Request for more information about Alandra Markman's work, and you can find him also through his name. We'll include all the links with this video, Seattle Truth Network. But you can also just reach out and start talking to people in your community and find people who care about this that you can walk with together. Put on white, get white balloons, and get out there, because we can make a difference. So thank you again for being here, and we'll see you on the streets in the march.
Hi, we're all marching here. Here we are. Okay. Should we get us in front of the fountain here?
Yeah, that's good. With the music.